What happens when a single decision made in the darkness of night ripples through an entire community, transforming not just one person's life, but the very definition of what it means to serve? This is the story of Officer Sarah Chen, whose routine patrol on a bitter February evening became a testament to human resilience, professional integrity, and the unexpected ways our deepest convictions are tested when everything we believe about duty is turned upside down. Part 1. The fluorescent lights in the precinct cast their usual harsh glow across the worn linoleum floors as Officer Sarah Chen adjusted her utility belt for what felt like the 100th time that evening. At 32, she had been patrolling the streets of Millbrook for 8 years, long enough to know that Tuesday nights in February were usually quiet affairs. The kind of shifts where the most excitement came from helping Mrs. Rodriguez retrieve her cat from yet another tree or mediating disputes between neighbors over snow removal. Sarah had always prided herself on being thorough, methodical, and unflappable. Her colleagues often joked that she could handle a hurricane with the same calm demeanor she brought to writing parking tickets. It wasn't that she lacked passion for the job, quite the opposite. She had joined the force after her younger brother Michael was killed by a drunk driver, driven by a fierce desire to protect others from the kind of senseless tragedy that had shattered her family. That night, as she signed out her patrol car and reviewed the evening's briefing notes, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees, keeping most sensible people indoors. The radio crackled occasionally with routine calls, a fender bender on Maple Street, a noise complaint from the college district, a request for a welfare check on an elderly resident who hadn't been seen in a few days. Sarah's assigned patrol area covered the industrial district on the west side of town, an area that became eerily quiet after the factories closed at 6 p.m. Row after row of warehouses, manufacturing plants, and small businesses lined the streets, their windows dark except for the occasional security light. It was the kind of place where shadows played tricks on your eyes and every sound seemed amplified in the winter air. As she drove slowly through the empty streets, her breath visible even inside the heated patrol car, Sarah reflected on the conversation she'd had with her partner Detective Mike Torres earlier that day. Mike had been pushing her to apply for a detective position that had opened up in the Criminal Investigation Division. The pay was better, the hours more predictable, and the work more intellectually challenging than routine patrol duty. But Sarah had hesitated. There was something about being on patrol, being the first line of contact between the police department and the community, that felt essential to her sense of purpose. She liked being the officer people called when they needed help, regardless of how small or large the problem might be. The detective position would mean leaving that direct community connection behind. Her radio crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. Unit 47, we have a report of suspicious activity at the old Hartwell Manufacturing Building on Industrial Avenue. Anonymous caller reported seeing lights moving inside the building. Building's been vacant for 6 months. Sarah keyed her radio. Unit 47 responding. ETA 3 minutes. The Hartwell Manufacturing Building had been a fixture in Millbrook for over 40 years before closing down the previous summer. The company had manufactured automotive parts, employing nearly 200 people before overseas competition forced them to shut down operations. The building sat on 5 acres of land, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Sarah had driven past it countless times during her patrols, noting how quickly it had fallen into disrepair. As she approached the building, Sarah killed her headlights and pulled into the shadows of an adjacent warehouse. The Hartwell building loomed before her, a massive concrete structure with rows of dark windows reflecting the distant streetlights. She sat quietly for several minutes, scanning the building for any signs of movement or unusual activity. At first, everything appeared normal. Then, just as she was beginning to think the anonymous caller had been mistaken, she saw it, a faint, flickering light moving past one of the second-floor windows. It appeared for just a few seconds before disappearing, then reappeared in a different window moments later. Sarah's pulse quickened slightly. In 8 years of patrol duty, she had responded to dozens of calls involving abandoned buildings. Most turned out to be teenagers looking for a place to hang out, homeless individuals seeking shelter, or urban explorers with too much time on their hands. Occasionally, however, these calls uncovered more serious criminal activity, drug operations, stolen goods storage, or worse. She reached for her radio to request backup, then hesitated. The standard protocol was clear: never enter a potentially dangerous situation alone. But she also knew that backup could be 20 minutes away on a night like this, when other units were spread thin across the city. By the time help arrived, whoever was inside might be long gone. Sarah made a decision that would later be scrutinized by her supervisors, her colleagues, and, ultimately, a federal investigation team. She decided to conduct a preliminary assessment of the situation before calling for backup. Just a quick perimeter check to gather more information about what exactly they were dealing with. She stepped out of her patrol car into the bitter cold, immediately feeling the wind cut through her uniform jacket. The snow crunched under her boots as she approached the fence surrounding the building. She walked slowly along the perimeter, looking for any obvious signs of forced entry. Near the back of the building, she found what she was looking for. A section of the chain-link fence had been cut, creating a hole large enough for a person to crawl through. Fresh footprints in the snow led from the hole toward a rear entrance to the building. Sarah counted at least 3 different sets of tracks, all appearing to be adult-sized. She keyed her radio quietly. "Dispatch, Unit 47. I have confirmed signs of unauthorized entry at the Hartwell building. Multiple subjects, unknown number currently inside. Requesting backup for building search." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Unit 47, backup en route. ETA 15 minutes. Do not enter the building until backup arrives. 15 minutes. Sarah looked at the footprints again, noting how crisp and clear they were in the fresh snow. These tracks were recent, very recent. She estimated they had been made within the last hour, possibly less. As she stood there weighing her options, she heard something that made her decision for her, the unmistakable sound of a child crying. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from somewhere inside the building. Sarah had heard that particular pitch and rhythm enough times during domestic disturbance calls to know the difference between a child in distress and other sounds that might be confused for crying. Every instinct Sarah had developed as both a police officer and as someone who had lost a family member to violence told her that this situation had just become something much more serious than teenagers trespassing in an abandoned building. She looked at her watch, 11:47 p.m. Backup was still at least 12 minutes away. 12 minutes could be a lifetime for a child in danger. Sarah made the second decision of the night that would change everything. She radioed dispatch with her location and intentions, then squeezed through the hole in the fence. The rear entrance to the building had been forced open, the metal door hanging slightly ajar. Sarah drew her service weapon and flashlight, pausing at the threshold to listen carefully. The crying sound had stopped, but she could hear muffled voices coming from somewhere deeper in the building. The interior of the Hartwell building was a maze of empty machinery bays, offices, and storage areas. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust-covered equipment that had been left behind when the company closed. The air smelled of rust, old oil, and something else she couldn't quite identify. She moved carefully through the ground floor, following the sound of voices toward what appeared to be a stairwell leading to the upper levels. The voices were clearer now, at least 2 adults, both male, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone suggested they were arguing about something. At the base of the stairs, Sarah paused again to listen. The conversation above had stopped. In the silence, she heard the child's crying resume, this time more clearly. It was definitely coming from the second floor. Sarah began climbing the stairs as quietly as possible, her weapon drawn and ready. Each step seemed to echo through the empty building despite her efforts to move silently. Halfway up, she heard one of the men speak again, this time loud enough for her to make out the words. "We need to move now. Someone might have heard." A second voice responded, "The kid won't stop crying. This is taking too long." Sarah's blood ran cold. Every law enforcement training scenario she had ever participated in flashed through her mind. This was no longer a simple trespassing call. She was dealing with a potential kidnapping situation, and she was alone in a building with armed suspects and a child victim. She reached the top of the stairs and found herself in a long corridor lined with what had once been administrative offices. Light spilled from under a door about halfway down the hall. That had to be where the voices were coming from. Sarah moved toward the light source, keeping close to the wall and trying to control her breathing. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain anyone nearby would be able to hear it. 20 feet from the door, she could make out the conversation clearly. "I told you this was a mistake," the first voice said. "We should have stuck to the original plan." "The original plan went out the window when she saw us," the second voice replied. "Now we have to deal with this." "Deal with what?" "She's just a kid. She doesn't understand what she saw." Sarah pressed herself against the wall next to the door and peered through the gap where it didn't quite meet the frame. What she saw made her radio for emergency backup immediately. Inside the office, illuminated by several battery-powered lanterns, were two men standing over a large table covered with what appeared to be stacks of documents and several laptop computers. In the corner of the room, a girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old sat tied to a chair, tears streaming down her face. But it wasn't the kidnapping scene that made Sarah call for immediate emergency response. It was what she recognized on the table and computer screens, detailed blueprints of the Millbrook Elementary School, the municipal water treatment plant, and what appeared to be floor plans of the federal courthouse downtown. This wasn't a simple kidnapping. Sarah had stumbled onto something much larger and more dangerous than anything she had encountered in 8 years of police work. As she waited for backup to arrive, Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her career. She could maintain her position and wait for help, following protocol and keeping herself safe. Or she could act immediately to protect the child, knowing that doing so might compromise whatever larger investigation this situation warranted. The choice she made in that moment would not only define the rest of her career but would ultimately expose a domestic terrorism plot that reached far beyond the borders of Millbrook, involving federal agencies, international connections, and a conspiracy that had been years in the making. But, for now, all Sarah Chen knew was that there was a terrified child 20 feet away from her, and two dangerous men who were discussing what to do with their young hostage. The clock on the wall read 11:58 p.m. In exactly 2 minutes, Officer Sarah Chen's routine Tuesday night patrol would become the catalyst for the largest federal investigation in her small town's history. Part 2. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance made both men in the office freeze. Sarah watched through the crack in the door as they exchanged alarmed glances, their casual conversation suddenly turning urgent and decisive. "That's not a coincidence," the first man said, quickly closing the laptop computers and gathering papers from the table. He was tall and lean, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, with the kind of precise movements that suggested military or law enforcement training. Sarah mentally catalogued every detail she could observe: age approximately 40, brown hair, no visible tattoos or distinguishing marks. The second man was shorter but more muscular, with graying hair and a scar running from his left ear to his jawline. Unlike his companion, he seemed less concerned about the approaching sirens and more focused on the crying child. "What do we do about her?" he asked, nodding toward the little girl. Sarah's training kicked into overdrive. She had perhaps 90 seconds before her backup arrived, and she needed to make a decision that could mean the difference between life and death for an innocent child. The men were clearly preparing to flee, and there was no guarantee they would leave their hostage behind. She keyed her radio one more time, speaking as quietly as possible. "Dispatch, Unit 47. I have visual confirmation of 2 adult male suspects and 1 child hostage, approximately 7 years old, female. Suspects appear to be preparing to flee. I am moving to secure the hostage." Before dispatch could respond, Sarah heard the tall man speak again. "We take her with us. She's seen too much." That settled it. Sarah couldn't wait for backup. She took a deep breath, centered herself in the doorway, and announced her presence. "Police! Everyone freeze! Show me your hands." The reaction was immediate and chaotic. The tall man dove behind the table, scattering papers and knocking over one of the lanterns. The shorter man reached inside his jacket, causing Sarah to shift her aim toward him. "Don't do it," she shouted. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The child's crying intensified, but Sarah couldn't afford to look away from the two men to assess her condition. Her peripheral vision told her the little girl was still tied to the chair but appeared to be physically unharmed. The shorter man slowly raised his hands, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. He was measuring distances, looking for opportunities. The tall man remained hidden behind the overturned table. "You behind the table," Sarah called out. "I want to see your hands above the table." Now. No response. The sirens were getting closer now, but Sarah knew she had to maintain control of the situation until backup arrived. She stepped fully into the room, keeping her weapon trained on the visible suspect while trying to maintain awareness of the hidden one. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked the child, hoping to establish some communication without taking her eyes off the men. "Emma," the little girl whispered between sobs. "Emma, I'm Officer Chen. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me if you're hurt?" Before Emma could answer, the tall man made his move. Papers scattered everywhere as he lunged from behind the table toward a window on the far side of the room. Sarah had to make a split-second decision: pursue the fleeing suspect or maintain control over the one she could see and the child hostage. She chose the child. "Stop right there," she yelled at the shorter man, who had started moving toward Emma when Sarah's attention was momentarily diverted. He froze again, but Sarah could see he was coiled like a spring, ready to make his own attempt at escape or something worse. The tall man had reached the window and was trying to force it open. The old industrial windows were heavy and stubborn, buying Sarah precious seconds. She could hear her backup pulling into the parking area below, their car doors slamming and voices calling out to each other. "Unit 47, what's your location?" her radio crackled. "Second floor, east corridor, office with lights," Sarah responded quickly. One suspect at the window attempting to flee, one suspect contained, child hostage secured. The shorter man seemed to realize his options were rapidly diminishing. The sound of boots on the stairs indicated backup was seconds away from reaching the second floor. But, instead of surrendering, he made a desperate move toward Emma. Sarah didn't hesitate. Years of training and an instinctive protective response merged into decisive action. She tackled the man before he could reach the child, both of them crashing into a stack of empty filing cabinets. Her service weapon skittered across the floor, out of reach. The man was stronger than Sarah had anticipated, and clearly had combat training. They struggled on the floor among scattered documents and broken glass from the overturned lantern. Sarah managed to get her handcuffs from her belt, but the suspect grabbed her wrist and twisted, trying to break her grip. At that moment, Officers Mike Torres and Janet Williams burst through the door, weapons drawn. "Police! Nobody move!" The tall man at the window gave up his escape attempt and raised his hands. The shorter man stopped struggling and allowed Sarah to cuff him. The immediate physical danger was over, but as Sarah stood up and brushed broken glass from her uniform, she realized they had stumbled onto something much larger than a simple kidnapping. While Torres and Williams secured the suspects and called for an ambulance to check on Emma, Sarah began examining the materials scattered around the room. What she saw made her request additional backup from the FBI field office in the state capitol. The documents weren't just building plans, they were detailed tactical assessments. The elementary school blueprints were marked with entry and exit points, security camera locations, and student population data. The water treatment plant documents included information about chemical storage, security protocols, and shift schedules. Most disturbing of all were detailed profiles of local law enforcement officers, including photographs and personal information about their families. Sarah found her service weapon and holstered it, then knelt beside Emma to begin the process of untying her restraints. The little girl had stopped crying but was clearly traumatized. Sarah spoke to her gently while working to free her hands. "Emma, you're safe now. Can you tell me how you got here? Do you remember what happened?" Emma nodded slowly. "They took me from the park. I was waiting for my mom to pick me up after soccer practice, and they said she sent them to get me." Sarah's heart sank. This was a stranger abduction, one of the most serious crimes law enforcement could investigate. But the presence of all the tactical planning materials suggested it might be connected to something even more sinister. Torres approached with his notebook ready. "Sarah, we need to get a preliminary statement while everything's fresh in your memory. This is going to be a major case." As Sarah began recounting the events of the evening, more law enforcement personnel arrived. The building soon filled with crime scene technicians, federal agents, and supervisors from multiple agencies. What had started as a routine patrol shift was rapidly becoming the largest criminal investigation in Millbrook's history. Emma was taken to the hospital for evaluation, accompanied by a social worker and a detective from the Crimes Against Children unit. Both suspects were transported to the county jail, where they would be held pending formal charges and federal involvement in the case. But, as the crime scene team began cataloging and photographing evidence, they discovered something that elevated the investigation to an entirely different level. Hidden behind a false panel in one of the filing cabinets were detailed maps of 12 different cities across 3 states, each marked with similar tactical assessments of schools, government buildings, and infrastructure targets. Sarah stood in the parking lot at 3:30 a.m., giving her statement to FBI Special Agent Catherine Morrison, who had driven down from the state capitol as soon as the nature of the evidence became clear. The temperature had dropped even further, and Sarah's breath formed clouds as she spoke. Officer Chen, Agent Morrison said after reviewing Sarah's preliminary report, "You need to understand that what you've uncovered here appears to be part of a much larger domestic terrorism investigation. These men weren't just planning to harm one child, they appear to have been planning coordinated attacks on multiple civilian targets." Sarah nodded, still trying to process the magnitude of what she had stumbled onto. "What happens now?" "Now, this becomes a federal case. We'll need extensive debriefings with you over the next several days. Your actions tonight may have prevented a catastrophic attack, but they've also put you at the center of an investigation that could take months or years to fully resolve." As Sarah drove home that morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and orange over the quiet streets of Millbrook, she reflected on the phone call she would need to make to Detective Torres about that promotion to the Criminal Investigation Division. After tonight, she had a feeling that decision was going to be made for her. What she didn't yet know was that the 2 men she had arrested were part of a cell that had been under surveillance by federal authorities for over 18 months. Her intervention had forced their hand and potentially saved dozens of lives, but it had also blown open an investigation that reached from small-town America to international terrorist networks. The quiet Tuesday night shift that was supposed to be filled with routine patrol duties had instead become the moment when Officer Sarah Chen stepped into a world of federal agents, classified briefings, and threats that extended far beyond anything she had ever imagined when she first put on the badge. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Sarah's phone was already ringing with calls from supervisors, federal agents, and reporters who had somehow already gotten wind of the story. The simple life of a small-town patrol officer was about to become something she never could have anticipated. Part 3 3 days after what the media had dubbed the Hartwell incident, Sarah Chen sat in a windowless conference room at the FBI field office, surrounded by federal agents, terrorism analysts, and enough classified documents to fill a small library. The transformation from small-town patrol officer to key witness in a federal terrorism investigation had happened so quickly that she was still struggling to comprehend the scope of what she had uncovered. Special Agent Morrison sat across from her, flanked by 2 other agents Sarah had been introduced to but whose names she was still trying to remember. Agent Rodriguez specialized in domestic terrorism networks, while Agent Kim worked in cyber crimes and digital forensics. The dynamic between them suggested this was a well-established team that had been working together for years. "Officer Chen," Agent Morrison began, opening a thick manila folder, "what I'm about to share with you is classified information that directly relates to your discovery at the Hartwell building. The 2 men you apprehended, David Pierce and Marcus Webb, are part of a domestic terrorist organization called the American Sovereignty Movement." Sarah had never heard of the group, but the way Agent Morrison pronounced the name suggested it was well known to federal authorities. "How long have you been tracking them?" Agent Rodriguez leaned forward. "The ASM has been on our radar for almost 2 years. They present themselves as a patriotic organization focused on protecting American values, but their real agenda involves coordinated attacks on government facilities and civilian targets they view as symbols of federal overreach." "Schools and water treatment plants are symbols of federal overreach?" Sarah asked, thinking about the documents she had seen scattered across the floor of that office. Agent Kim opened his laptop and turned it toward Sarah. The screen showed a complex organizational chart with photographs, names, and connecting lines that looked like something from a crime television show. The ASM believes that public education and municipal infrastructure are tools of government control. Their ultimate goal is to create enough chaos and fear to justify what they call a constitutional reset, essentially, the collapse of current government institutions. Sarah studied the chart, recognizing the photographs of Pierce and Webb among dozens of other faces. Some were marked with red X's, others with green check marks. What do the different symbols mean? Red X means arrested or deceased, Agent Morrison explained. Green check marks are individuals still at large. As you can see, your actions on Tuesday night resulted in the arrest of 2 significant players, but there are still many others active in the network. The scope of the investigation was staggering. Sarah counted at least 40 different individuals on the chart, connected by lines indicating various relationships, some criminal, some familial, some financial. Cities across a dozen states were marked with different colored pins, indicating various stages of planning and preparation. Agent Rodriguez pulled out a separate folder. The evidence you recovered from the Hartwell building has allowed us to connect several previously separate investigations. Those tactical assessments weren't just for Millbrook, they were templates being used by ASM cells in multiple states. Sarah felt a chill as she realized how close her small town had come to being the site of a coordinated terrorist attack. What exactly were they planning? Agent Morrison exchanged glances with her colleagues before answering. Based on the materials you recovered and intelligence we've gathered from other sources, we believe the ASM was planning a series of simultaneous attacks designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing their operational risk. Schools during pickup and drop-off times, water treatment facilities during shift changes, government buildings during public meetings. And, Emma? How does kidnapping a 7-year-old fit into their plan? Agent Kim closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. That appears to have been an unplanned complication. Our analysis of their communication suggests Pierce and Webb were conducting reconnaissance at the elementary school when Emma saw them taking photographs and measurements. They panicked and decided they needed to keep her quiet until their operation was complete. Sarah thought about Emma, who she had visited in the hospital the day before. The little girl was physically unharmed but clearly traumatized by her experience. A team of child psychologists was working with her and her family to help process what had happened. How is the investigation proceeding? Sarah asked. Agent Morrison opened another folder, this one containing what appeared to be surveillance photographs and transcripts. Your intervention forced us to accelerate our timeline significantly. We had been planning to let Pierce and Webb continue their activities while we monitored their communications and identified other members of their cell. When you arrested them, we had to move quickly to prevent other cells from going underground. Are you saying I compromised your investigation? Quite the opposite, Agent Rodriguez interjected quickly. Your actions may have forced us to change our approach, but they also prevented what could have been a devastating attack. We estimate that Pierce and Webb were less than 2 weeks away from executing their plan. Agent Kim reopened his laptop and showed Sarah a series of intercepted text messages and emails. Since their arrest, we've seen a significant increase in communication activity among other ASM members. They're trying to determine how much we know and whether their other operations have been compromised. Sarah read through several of the messages, noting references to the Millbrook problem and discussions about whether to accelerate other timelines. The casual way these individuals discussed violence against innocent civilians was chilling. What happens next? She asked. Agent Morrison gathered up the folders and closed them. Next, we use the intelligence you've provided to dismantle as much of the ASM network as possible. There will be arrests in multiple states over the coming weeks. Some will be high-profile, others will happen quietly to avoid alerting additional suspects. And my role in all this? Your role is just beginning, Agent Kim said. Pierce and Webb will eventually go to trial, and you'll be a key witness. But, more importantly, the ASM now views you as a significant threat to their operations. They know you discovered their plans and can identify their members. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Are you saying I'm in danger? Agent Rodriguez nodded grimly. We're saying you need to be very careful. The ASM has demonstrated a willingness to use violence against anyone they perceive as an obstacle to their goals. Law enforcement officers who have interfered with their operations have been targeted in the past. The room fell silent as the implications of that statement settled in. Sarah had joined the police force to help protect her community, not to become a target herself. But she realized that Tuesday night had fundamentally changed her relationship with both her job and her personal safety. Agent Morrison stood up and walked to a whiteboard covered with photographs and connecting lines. Officer Chen, I want to offer you an opportunity. The FBI is looking to recruit experienced local law enforcement officers to work with our domestic terrorism task force. Your actions this week demonstrate exactly the kind of instincts and decision-making we need. Sarah was taken aback. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to continue the work you started Tuesday night. To help us identify and stop other groups like the ASM before they can carry out their plans. To use your law enforcement experience in service of protecting not just your community, but communities across the country. The offer was tempting, but Sarah thought about Detective Torres and the promotion to criminal investigation that was still waiting for her back in Millbrook. She thought about the familiar streets she had patrolled for 8 years, the community members who knew her by name, the sense of being directly connected to the people she had sworn to serve and protect. I need time to think about it, she said. Agent Rodriguez handed her a business card. Of course. But don't take too long. The ASM isn't going to wait while you decide whether you want to continue fighting them. As Sarah drove back to Millbrook that afternoon, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 72 hours. The routine patrol officer who had signed out her car Tuesday night no longer existed. In her place was someone who had seen the face of domestic terrorism, who carried classified information about threats to national security, and who would forever be looking over her shoulder for dangers she had never previously imagined. Her phone rang as she crossed the city limits into Millbrook. Detective Torres's name appeared on the display. Sarah, where are you? We need to talk. There have been some developments in the case, and Chief Martinez wants to see you immediately. What kind of developments? The kind that can't be discussed over the phone. How quickly can you get to the station? Sarah checked her watch. It was 4:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. Under normal circumstances, she would be preparing for another quiet weekend patrol shift. Instead, she was racing back to the police station to discuss classified federal investigations and contemplate a career change that would take her far from the small town she had called home for her entire life. As she pulled into the station parking lot, Sarah noticed several unmarked federal vehicles and a news van from the regional television station. Whatever developments Torres had referred to, they were significant enough to draw both federal attention and media coverage. The simple life of Officer Sarah Chen was rapidly becoming a memory, replaced by complexities and responsibilities she was still learning to navigate. But, as she walked toward the station entrance, she realized that Tuesday night had shown her something important about herself. When faced with a choice between personal safety and protecting others, she would always choose to protect others. That realization would guide every decision she made in the weeks to come, as the investigation into the American sovereignty movement expanded beyond anything she could have imagined during that cold February night at the Hartwell building. Part 4 Chief Martinez's office had been transformed into a command center that looked more like something from a federal law enforcement facility than a small-town police station. Multiple computer monitors displayed maps, photographs, and data streams that Sarah didn't recognize. 3 FBI agents she hadn't met before were seated around the conference table, while Chief Martinez paced behind his desk with the kind of nervous energy that indicated significant pressure from above. Sarah, sit down, the chief said without his usual pleasantries. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. Agent Morrison was there, along with 2 new faces, Agent Thompson from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and Agent Clark from the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The presence of behavioral analysts suggested the investigation had taken on psychological dimensions that went beyond simple criminal activity. Officer Chen, Agent Thompson began, we've been analyzing communications intercepted from ASM members since Pierce and Webb were arrested. What we've discovered is concerning on multiple levels. She opened a laptop and turned it toward Sarah. The screen showed a series of forum posts and encrypted messages that had been decoded by federal cyber specialists. Sarah read through several of them, her concern growing with each message. Target identified, S. Chen, Millbrook PD, interference level, critical. Response authorization, level 3. What does level 3 mean? Sarah asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Agent Clark consulted his notes. In ASM operational terminology, Level 3 authorization means elimination of the target is approved and resources will be allocated to accomplish that objective. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Sarah felt her mouth go dry. "They're planning to kill me." "We believe they're planning to try," Agent Thompson corrected. "But we also believe we can use their interest in you to advance our investigation significantly." Chief Martinez stopped pacing and leaned against his desk. "Sarah, before we go any further, I want you to understand that what these agents are about to propose is entirely voluntary. You can walk away from this conversation right now, take extended leave, and relocate until this investigation is concluded." Sarah looked around the room at the serious faces of the federal agents and her police chief. 3 days ago, her biggest concern had been whether to apply for a detective position. Now she was being given the choice between going into hiding or potentially putting herself in mortal danger to help catch domestic terrorists. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Agent Morrison pulled out a thick folder marked Classified, Operation Millbrook. "We're proposing that you help us conduct a controlled operation designed to draw ASM operatives into situations where we can identify and arrest them." "You want me to be bait?" Agent Thompson nodded. "In law enforcement terms, yes. But you would never be in actual danger. You would be under constant surveillance by multiple federal agents, with backup position to respond within seconds of any threat materializing." Agent Clark opened his own laptop and showed Sarah a detailed operational plan. The ASM operates in small, semi-autonomous cells that communicate through encrypted channels. When one cell receives a Level 3 authorization, they typically spend several weeks conducting reconnaissance on the target before attempting to carry out the elimination. During that reconnaissance phase, Agent Morrison continued, they make themselves vulnerable to identification and arrest. But only if the target follows predictable patterns that allow the surveillance to be conducted. Sarah studied the operational plan, noting the complex coordination between local police, FBI agents, and other federal resources. "How many people would be involved in protecting me?" "At any given time, you would have at least 6 federal agents maintaining visual contact with you," Agent Thompson replied. "Additional agents would be positioned at your home, your workplace, and any locations you visit regularly." Chief Martinez sat down across from Sarah. "I've been in law enforcement for 26 years, and I've never seen anything like this. The FBI is offering to essentially turn our entire jurisdiction into a federal operations zone to protect one of my officers while she helps them catch domestic terrorists." The magnitude of the proposal was overwhelming. Sarah thought about her quiet apartment, her regular patrol routes, her weekend routines, all of which would be monitored and protected by federal agents carrying out a complex anti-terrorism operation. "What would be required of me specifically?" she asked. Agent Clark handed her a detailed schedule. "You would maintain your regular patrol duties, but follow predetermined routes that create opportunities for surveillance and potential arrest of ASM operatives. You would live in your own home, but with round-the-clock protection. You would continue your normal social activities, but with agents positioned to monitor and respond to any threats." "For how long?" Agent Morrison consulted her notes. "Our experience with similar operations suggests we would either achieve our objectives or determine the approach isn't working within 4 to 6 weeks." Sarah thought about Emma, still recovering from her traumatic experience. She thought about the tactical assessments that had been found in the Hartwell building, detailed plans to attack schools, government buildings, and infrastructure that served her community. She thought about the dozens of faces on the organizational chart, representing individuals who were planning to commit acts of terrorism against innocent civilians. "If I don't do this, what happens to the investigation?" Agent Thompson leaned forward. "The investigation continues, but without the advantage of having an identified target that we can use to draw ASM operatives into the open. It becomes much more difficult to prevent their planned attacks and much easier for them to disappear and reorganize." Chief Martinez stood up and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. "Sarah, I need to be completely honest with you. If you agree to this operation, you'll be taking a risk that goes far beyond anything I ever expected to ask of my officers. But if you don't agree, we may be looking at terrorist attacks in our community and others that could have been prevented." The decision Sarah faced was unlike anything covered in law enforcement training. She was being asked to deliberately make herself a target for domestic terrorists in order to help federal authorities dismantle a network that posed a threat to communities across multiple states. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Torres. "Sarah, I heard about the federal operation. Whatever you decide, you have my complete support. But, remember what you told me about why you became a cop, to protect people from the kind of senseless violence that took your brother." Sarah looked around the room at the agents and her chief, all waiting for her decision. She thought about her brother Michael, killed by a drunk driver 8 years ago. She thought about Emma, traumatized by her kidnapping but ultimately safe because Sarah had been willing to enter that building alone. She thought about the children who attended Millbrook Elementary School, the families who depended on the municipal water system, the citizens who worked in government buildings that had been targeted for attack. "I'll do it," she said quietly. Agent Morrison nodded approvingly. "Operation Millbrook begins tomorrow morning. From this point forward, every aspect of your daily routine will be carefully coordinated to maximize the safety of both you and our operatives while creating opportunities to identify and arrest ASM members." Agent Thompson opened another folder. "We'll need to brief you on recognition techniques, communication protocols, and emergency procedures. You'll also need to meet the agents who will be responsible for your protection." As the briefing continued late into the evening, Sarah realized she was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The small-town police officer who had started her shift on Tuesday night was being replaced by someone who would spend the next several weeks serving as a federal operative in a domestic terrorism investigation. But, more than that, she was discovering something about herself that she hadn't fully understood before. Her commitment to protecting others wasn't just professional, it was fundamental to who she was as a person. When faced with the choice between personal safety and public service, the choice was clear. By the time she left the police station that night, Sarah Chen was no longer just Officer Chen of the Millbrook Police Department. She was a key participant in Operation Millbrook, a federal investigation that would determine whether domestic terrorists could be stopped before they carried out attacks against civilian targets. The transformation was complete, and there was no going back. Tuesday night had started with a routine patrol and had led to this moment, a decision that would define not just her career, but her understanding of duty, courage, and the price of protecting others from those who would do them harm. As she drove home under the watchful eyes of federal agents positioned throughout her neighborhood, Sarah reflected on the journey from that anonymous tip about lights in an abandoned building to this moment. Every decision she had made, entering the building alone, confronting the armed suspects, choosing to participate in the federal operation, had been guided by the same principle that led her to become a police officer in the first place. Some people were willing to risk their own safety to protect others. Sarah Chen had always been one of those people, but she was only now beginning to understand the full implications of that commitment. Part 5. 6 weeks after Operation Millbrook began, Sarah Chen stood in the federal courthouse, preparing to testify in what had become the largest domestic terrorism prosecution in the region's history. The operation had exceeded all expectations, resulting in the arrest of 17 ASM members across 4 states and the seizure of enough weapons and explosive materials to carry out the coordinated attacks that had been planned for dozens of civilian targets. The path from that February night at the Hartwell building to this moment had been unlike anything she could have imagined when she first put on a police uniform. The quiet patrol officer who had responded to reports of suspicious lights in an abandoned building had become a federal witness whose testimony would help put domestic terrorists in prison for decades. Agent Morrison sat beside her in the witness preparation room, reviewing the timeline of events that would be crucial to the prosecution's case. On the table between them were photographs, documents, and evidence that told the story of how a routine police call had unraveled an extensive terrorist network. "Are you ready for this?" Agent Morrison asked, noting the nervous energy that Sarah was trying to conceal. Sarah nodded, though she felt anything but ready. "I've testified in court before, but never in a case like this. Never with this much at stake. The defense attorneys are going to challenge every aspect of your actions that night," Agent Morrison warned. "They'll argue that you entered the building illegally, that you compromised their clients' constitutional rights, that the evidence should be suppressed because of procedural violations." Sarah had been preparing for those challenges for weeks. Constitutional law experts, federal prosecutors, and law enforcement training specialists had all worked with her to ensure she could explain and defend every decision she had made during those crucial hours at the Hartwell building. The most important thing to remember, Agent Morrison continued, is that you acted to protect a child in immediate danger. Everything else followed from that fundamental duty as a law enforcement officer. Through the window of the courthouse, Sarah could see protesters gathered on both sides of the building's steps. Supporters of the arrested ASM members carried signs declaring them patriots and political prisoners, while counter-protesters held photographs of the potential victims, children from the targeted schools, workers from the planned infrastructure attacks, government employees whose buildings had been marked for bombing. The contrast was jarring. Sarah had spent weeks living under federal protection, knowing that some people viewed her as a hero for stopping a terrorist plot while others saw her as an enemy of American liberty. The complexity of those perspectives had been one of the most challenging aspects of the entire experience. Detective Torres appeared in the doorway of the preparation room. He had been promoted to sergeant during the weeks when Sarah was working with federal agents, and had become her primary liaison with the Millbrook Police Department throughout the operation. "Sarah, Chief Martinez wanted me to give you this," he said, handing her an envelope marked confidential. Inside was a letter from the chief, along with official documents that Sarah recognized as promotion paperwork. She had been promoted to detective, effective immediately, with assignment to a newly created position liaison with federal law enforcement agencies investigating domestic terrorism. "Congratulations," Torres said with a grin. "Looks like you won't be going back to patrol anytime soon." Sarah smiled, remembering the conversation they had shared weeks ago about applying for detective positions. The promotion she had been considering then seemed like a small step compared to the career transformation she had experienced since that February night. Agent Morrison checked her watch. "It's time. The prosecution is ready to call you as their first witness." The federal courthouse courtroom was packed with law enforcement officers, federal agents, family members of the defendants, journalists, and legal observers. Sarah had never been in a room with so many people whose lives had been affected by a single law enforcement incident. As she walked to the witness stand, Sarah's mind flashed back to specific moments from that night: the sound of Emma crying in the darkness, the sight of tactical plans spread across the table, the split-second decision to enter the building alone rather than wait for backup. Each of those moments had led directly to this courtroom and the 17 defendants who were now facing federal terrorism charges. The prosecution's questioning was methodical and thorough. Sarah recounted every detail of her patrol that night, explaining her decision-making process at each crucial juncture. She described finding the cut fence, hearing the child crying, observing the suspects and evidence, and making the arrests that had ultimately prevented a coordinated terrorist attack. The defense cross-examination was aggressive but predictable. Defense attorneys questioned her authority to enter the building, suggested she had violated their client's Fourth Amendment rights, and argued that the evidence should be suppressed because of procedural violations. But Sarah had prepared for these challenges. She calmly explained the exigent circumstances that justified her actions: the immediate danger to a child hostage, the evidence of flight risk, the reasonable belief that waiting for backup could result in loss of life. Legal experts had spent weeks helping her understand the constitutional principles that supported her decisions. The most powerful moment of her testimony came when the prosecution asked her to describe her thoughts as she entered the Hartwell building that night. "I thought about my brother Michael," Sarah said, her voice steady but emotional. "He was killed by someone who made a choice that prioritized their own interests over the safety of innocent people. When I heard that child crying, I knew I had a choice to make. I could prioritize my own safety and wait for backup, or I could prioritize the child's safety and act immediately." "What guided your decision?" "The same thing that guided my decision to become a police officer in the first place. Sometimes protecting others requires accepting personal risk. That's what we sign up for when we take the oath." The courtroom was silent as Sarah's words settled. Even some of the defense attorneys seemed affected by the sincerity and clarity of her explanation. After 3 days of testimony, Sarah's role in the prosecution was complete. The trial would continue for weeks, but her part of the story had been told. As she left the courthouse, she was approached by Agent Morrison and several other federal agents who had become colleagues and friends during the operation. "Sarah," Agent Morrison said, "I want to extend a formal offer for you to join the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Task Force." Your instincts, decision-making, and ability to work under pressure are exactly what we need." Sarah considered the offer, as she had many times over the past 6 weeks. The federal position would offer opportunities for advancement, higher pay, and the chance to work on cases that affected national security. It would also mean leaving Millbrook, the community she had served for 8 years, and the connections that had originally drawn her to law enforcement. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally. "But I think I can do more good staying here, working as a liaison between local law enforcement and federal agencies. There are other small towns with officers who might face situations like mine. Someone needs to help them understand how to recognize and respond to domestic terrorism threats." Agent Morrison smiled and shook her hand. "I think you're making exactly the right choice. The job offer stands if you ever change your mind." As Sarah drove back to Millbrook that afternoon, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 weeks ago, she had been a patrol officer contemplating a promotion to detective. Now she was a detective whose expertise in domestic terrorism investigations was being sought by federal agencies across the country. But, more importantly, she had discovered something fundamental about herself and her commitment to law enforcement. The decision to enter the Hartwell building alone hadn't been about heroics or career advancement, it had been about the fundamental responsibility to protect others, regardless of personal risk. That night, as Sarah prepared for her first shift as Detective Chen, she received a call from Emma's mother. Emma was doing well in her recovery, had returned to school, and wanted Sarah to know that she felt safe because there were police officers like her who were willing to help children in danger. Sarah hung up the phone and looked out her apartment window at the quiet streets of Millbrook. Tomorrow she would begin her new role as a detective specializing in domestic terrorism liaison work. She would help train other officers to recognize the signs of terrorist activity, assist federal agents in investigating threats to small communities, and serve as a bridge between local law enforcement and national security agencies. The routine patrol shift that had started on a cold February night had evolved into a career that Sarah never could have anticipated. But, as she prepared for this new phase of her professional life, she knew that the same principles that had guided her actions at the Hartwell building would continue to guide her work. Protect others, regardless of personal risk. Act decisively when innocent lives are in danger. Never forget that law enforcement is fundamentally about serving the community, even when that service requires extraordinary courage. Detective Sarah Chen was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, confident that her commitment to those principles would guide her through whatever situations she might encounter in the years to come. The quiet patrol officer was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes a single decision made in the darkness can change not just one life, but an entire community's understanding of duty, courage, and service.